In the 1980s, my aunt, who was in her early 20s at the time, was traveling long distances between her parents' home and my uncle's. It was a transitional period for her as she had recently graduated from college and was not yet settled with my uncle. During these journeys, she would drive through several states, often traveling through desert areas where she might not see another car or gas station for hours. One day on one of her trips, my aunt noticed another vehicle slowly catching up to hers. She was listening to the radio and singing along, so she didn't notice until the other car got closer. When she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw that the other driver was flashing their headlights and signaling for her to stop. Alarmed, my aunt slowed down and pulled over. She realized that the other car had been trying to get her attention, indicating a gas station ahead. They exchanged friendly greetings and the other driver continued on his way. Anxious and scared, Hank stepped on the gas, driving onto the highway in search of a safe place to stop and figure out what had happened. Her heart pounded as she wondered what had caused the dark car to follow her. The car behind her pulled out, signaling for her to stop. Fearing the worst, Hank began to panic, questioning what was going on. The driver gestured for her to pull over, but she felt trapped without her phone. She pressed forward, her resolve wavering. She began to doubt whether she really felt what she thought she felt. As the dark car sped up, she began to slow down. The car suddenly swerved into the oncoming lane, catching up with her aunt's vehicle. The driver smiled at her and gestured ahead, saying, "Follow me." As she looked into his eyes, she felt a sickening sensation in her stomach. The words, "Don't stop," echoed in her mind. He seemed intimidating and untrustworthy, and she noticed a couple of missing teeth in his grin. She would never forget the chills that ran down her spine. This quickly dispelled any thoughts of stopping, and she pressed down on the accelerator to escape. The driver chased her, slowing when she did. She sped up and so did he. It reached a point where he began to push her off the road. Tears welled up in her eyes as he continued to terrorize her. Alone in the middle of nowhere, after what seemed like forever, she finally saw a couple of trucks in the distance. She felt that if she could just get closer or at least stand between them, she would be safe. So, she started running, flashed her lights, honked her horn, and tried to get the truck's attention until she was close enough to them. Then, she saw a dark car slowing down and eventually disappearing from sight. She stayed with the trucks for a few hours until she felt safe enough to stop at a gas station and let out a sigh of relief. Fast forward a few years later, my aunt and uncle were married. He was a high-ranking prosecutor in Las Vegas and she was a full-time mother to several children. Since then, I've known my aunt. She has been fascinated by TV shows like True Crime and Unsolved Mysteries, which are always on at their house. An unexpected event occurred. While my aunt was folding laundry in the kitchen and watching TV in the other room, an interview with a man discussing his tactics for victimizing people was being broadcast. As she picked up a pair of socks, the interviewer described one of the man's methods: waiting on the side of the road and following cars with his family inside. He would flash his lights and signal for them to stop, then open the hood of their car and fix their problem. The man explained that sometimes a car with a female driver would pass, and he would pursue it. My aunt continued listening, stunned by what she was hearing. Eventually, the victim stopped, and the man explained what was wrong with their car. They discussed it, and he fixed the problem by pulling some wires. They asked me if there was a problem, and I explained that my friend ran a store in the next town and would offer a fair price if they wanted to purchase something. As I spoke, my aunt slowly moved towards the living room, and I felt a sense of unease. I couldn't help but think about how I had attacked and killed people, burying their bodies somewhere in the desert. When they asked how many times this had happened, I replied that they would never be able to find all the bodies, as I couldn't even begin to count them. Maybe 2 or 3, maybe more. My aunt stood alone, staring at me with the same toothless grin that she had seen on Henry Lee that night on the highway. That day, Lucas, was a hot summer day, and I decided to go hiking. I got lost in the wilderness, walking mile after mile, until I found my way back. But when I did, I realized I was so far from my car that I had no idea which direction to head. Exhausted, I continued walking for a few more miles before finally arriving home late. At night, on a hot and sunny summer day, I was driving home after spending many hours lost in the mountains and forests. About 15 miles away from my rural home, I stopped to pick up a hitchhiker. As I started to drive, I saw a heavily built man standing on the side of the road, hitchhiking. I felt sorry for him and stopped to let him in. I didn't realize that my day's trials weren't over yet. When he entered the car, we exchanged greetings and started driving to my house, chatting casually. He told me that he was unemployed and worked as an operator on heavy construction equipment before. His arm was prosthetic, made of hard plastic with a metal hook instead of a hand, due to an accident. We continued talking about his life and work, and I felt grateful for the opportunity to help him. Despite the challenges he faced, he remained positive and optimistic. His story inspired me to keep going and not give up on my own journey. Whose house had been confiscated by the bank, he had illegally settled on his own territory. He probably hitchhiked during the day to avoid eviction by the sheriff and returned in the evening to enter the basement. Therefore, he was essentially a homeless drifter with an address. This didn't concern me at the time, but perhaps it should have. I have a repertoire of interesting stories that I enjoy telling. I dusted off one and told him a few stories to pass the time and make the journey easier. He listened politely, and I found he enjoyed talking a little too. My stories must have encouraged him because he started to tell me a strange story about himself. He started by saying that, years ago, during a severe snowstorm, according to his account, a woman had an accident on the U.S. route that passed his house. He said that he had been seriously injured in an accident and was bleeding. He went on to tell his story, explaining that the weather had been so bad and the road had been impassable. Being a construction worker, he had a plan B, and he loaded the injured woman onto the back of his truck. He then drove for 30 miles through the snowstorm, delivering her to a major hospital. It was a remarkable story indeed. I thought I was quite knowledgeable about the streets, having seen many different places in the world, including some of the more dangerous ones. I believe the author may have changed the story slightly in order to protect the people he wanted to expose. However, he has disguised his true intentions and what actually happened. In other words, I think there is a grain of truth to his story, but he has altered some details. I noticed some inconsistencies quickly, and I am able to analyze them with the help of my street smarts, which I think is another way of saying survival instinct. I think the author used a backhoe to hide the body, though I'm not sure why. I got the impression we didn't have much time to think about it because the trip was almost over. It may sound strange that I reached this conclusion, but maybe what happens next will make you agree with me. After finishing his story, we arrived at the turn leading to his house. As I pulled into the long driveway, he started making inappropriate suggestions about what he wanted to happen, even though I had already politely told him that it was none of his business. When we reached his house, the conversation ended. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I realized that the situation had quickly escalated, but I knew that I needed to stay firm and not let him intimidate me. Despite his attempts to intimidate me, I remained calm and collected. He didn't back down, but he didn't physically threaten me either. Instead, he continued to stare at me with a hard, unyielding gaze. I knew that this was dangerous, and I was glad that I had chosen to remain in my car. His silence and intensity were unnerving, but I refused to be intimidated. I kept my composure and waited for him to make the next move. In the end, he got out of his car and walked away, leaving me feeling relieved and grateful for having stood my ground. Having studied self-defense, I knew that if I turned my back, he would attack. Therefore, I stood my ground and kept eye contact with him. After a few moments, he lowered his arm and got out of the car. We exchanged a few words, but I managed to defuse the situation and we went our separate ways. Although he was larger than me, he was also a builder with strong arms from hard work. His weight was an advantage in a physical confrontation, but I had a plan in case the hitchhiker proved to be aggressive. My plan was to drive into his house at high speed, knocking him unconscious through the windshield. While I hoped he might get injured, the idea was that neighbors would hear the noise of a high-speed accident and come to investigate. I also considered honking my horn, but if he intended to knock me unconscious in order to attack, it seemed unlikely that I would get the chance to do so. Wake up again. Someone so dangerous would not leave a witness who could send them to jail for the rest of their life. They were likely a career criminal. In my first encounter with this person, I learned another secret from martial arts. Never look away. Hold the gas, read the intent, and then spontaneously block or deflect the initial attack. He could see from my eyes that I was ready to fight to the death, that I was fully prepared. The situation ended when he opened the door and, not expecting anything, got out of the car. I quickly drove away from the yard, turned around, gave him one last look, and headed for the exit. I thought it was the most dangerous situation I had ever encountered. I should call the police and let them know about this person, as it's only a matter of time before they may try to hurt someone. At least the police would have a record of them, but I was worried that they wouldn't take my concerns seriously. There was no immediate threat or attack, so I didn't know what else to do. The reason I didn't want to talk about it is because the incident has passed and I wanted to move on. The police report would take up valuable time during my lunch break, and I might face skepticism or criticism for reporting something that turned out to be nothing. In retrospect, I now realize that it was a mistake. After about 10 years, the real estate seemed like a very depressing sight. It was an active crime scene. A woman from a neighboring state had moved into this house, but I didn't know it was a crime scene until one day when I drove past and saw a state police bus, 5 cruisers, and a police helicopter. Everything had been marked with crime scene tape. I thought, oh no, I should have said something. I was being lazy and more concerned about myself on the day the girl's body was found in the local pond, in a freezer inside the house. There had been dark stories about a couple abusing a young homeless girl. A couple of days after the incident, as the investigation came to an end and only a few police cars were still patrolling the area, I decided to report a strange event that had happened to me. I contacted the state police and described the situation that Captain Hook told me about the day after the event. The area was still noisy, and I suspected that the police were looking for other possible suspects, although some did appear. However, no charges were filed, and both suspects remained in prison for other charges. The last thing I heard from the police was a warning to be more careful and to report anything suspicious I see in the future. As a 25-year-old woman, I recently experienced an event that I couldn't shake off. While taking care of my boyfriend's dog, something unusual happened. My boyfriend's house is located in a remote area at the foot of a hill, surrounded by acres of land next to a busy highway. In contrast to the small rural area where I live, which is both very quiet and safe, the community is close-knit, but people tend to keep to themselves. There are a number of abandoned and dilapidated houses alongside well-maintained ones, typical of a rural area. Therefore, I did not feel unsafe when I agreed to look after my boyfriend's property and his dog, Hennessy. Hennessy is an 115-pound black American bulldog mix, half English Labrador, and he is all muscle. Since my boyfriend and I began dating, he has become very protective of me and my other dog, Lottie, a poodle mix weighing 57 pounds. I am a groomer, so I often give Lottie silly haircuts with bows, as one of my dogs has an intimidating appearance due to his strength. Since I cannot walk both Hennessy and Lottie together, I usually take Hennessy out for a walk alone and then return for Lottie. And I take Hennessy out for a walk by myself. We walk for about 30 minutes each, and I like to bring Hennessy along in the evening. I feel safer with him, because it's getting dark, which is important, because there was an incident about 4 nights ago. When I was out walking with La, in the middle of the walk, I had a really strange feeling that someone was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I looked behind me and saw a man wearing a hoodie, standing about 30 feet away, next to an old, dilapidated house. Immediately, I thought the hoodie looked strange. I live in Northern California, and it's early August, so the temperature never drops below 87 degrees in the evenings, especially when the sun is still shining. At first, I tried to ignore the feeling, as I can be prone to paranoia after reading stories about stranger danger. As I walked, the sun set and the streets grew darker. I looked again. From time to time, I noticed a man following me, keeping a distance of about 30 feet between us. No matter what I did, he would follow. If I turned a corner, so would he. If I increased my speed, so did he. Finally, we reached a highway, and as I crossed it, a car passed us at high speed. I no longer hoped the man would increase the distance between us, but he did. It happened, and he stopped chasing me. I ran towards the house as quickly as I could, not wanting to look back, but then I heard his footsteps on the gravel. I noticed him, and he started barking and growling. I tried to keep moving and, fortunately, returned to the house, slammed and locked the door. I hoped that would be the end of it, but after I closed and locked the door, I felt someone trying to open it. The dogs heard it and started barking, as they always do when someone is at the door. There was nobody outside the door, but I could speak to whoever was on the other side. The door was quite thin, so I shouted out and asked who was there. Over the barking I could hear. I heard a man's voice say, "I love your dog. Can I meet her?" For some reason, the way he said it was quite creepy, as if there was nothing behind it. It was as if he had rehearsed that phrase or decided to say it beforehand. I shouted back no, and asked him to leave. He was silent for a second, then he said again, "Can I meet your dog?" This time, he started turning the door handle and pressing down on the door. By then, Hennessy, my dog, realized that something was wrong and started growling. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I don't know what came over me, but I pushed Elle into the bathroom and grabbed Hennessy by the collar, holding him close to the door. He was still barking at me, and I was getting frustrated. I heard a man repeat that he wanted to meet my dog, and I shouted at him to leave. He stopped and then crashed into my door. I saw the door move, and at that moment I unlocked it and opened it wide enough for Hennessy to get out. About halfway out, he was still going crazy, and my arm started to hurt from holding him down. I could hear his teeth chattering, and he was biting furiously. The man was not expecting Hennessy and stumbled back, almost fell, and cursed. While he was trying to stay on his feet, he didn't even look at me. Instead, he ran up the slope as quickly as he could and disappeared from sight. I managed to pull Hennessy back and called the police to report what had happened. I never found out what the man was up to. They examined the scene and left. The guy, well, basically told me that there was nothing I could do. They took my statement and said they would contact me if anything came out. I was so grateful for that. Because of that, I snuggled up to him and cried all night because everyone realized how terrible it was. The next day, I went and bought him the biggest bone I could find at a pet store, which was almost an hour away. He deserved it, and I also got something too, I don't know why. When I didn't get to him, there were 2 dogs barking inside. I guess he didn't realize he was hearing 2 barks, or I guess, if I had had 2 dogs. There were 2 dogs that looked like my furry one. I mean, he wasn't afraid of the poodle. I'm grateful that he didn't have a firearm, and looking back, I should have just called the police and kept the door closed. But I hope he saw Hennessy and knows not to go back and mess with us. Because if he does, I will let my big, sweet boy rip my arm off.